Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Amanda and today we are going to be doing my July wrap-up. Yes, so I read 17 books in the month of July, and because I read so many books, this video will be done just like all the other ones except for the fact that the first 2 weeks of July I didn't have a voice, so I ended up splitting up this video into the first 3 weeks and then the last week. So let's go over my stats real quick. So in the month of July, I ended up reading 17 books for a total this year of 110 books so far. I'm so thrilled that I broke 100 this month. It feels great. It feels like I'm getting closer and closer to the end goal. I feel like at this point my end goal is just kind of wishy-washy and I don't actually know what I'm going for, but whatever. Let's move on. It's all good. It was quite bad. On top of that, I also ended up DNFing 6 books this month, just wasn't feeling them. And then I also put on pause 1 book, which I'll be getting to hopefully before the end of this year. So out of all the books that I was able to finish, I read 2 sci-fi books, 5 fantasy books, 1 YA sci-fi book, which I think is the first time I've read one this year, 1 dystopian book, 2 YA fantasy books, 1 horror book, and 4 graphic novels, which divided up into a middle grade fantasy, a dystopian, a contemporary, and a horror. A nice little blend of books that I read this month. I'm pretty excited to talk to you about that. I am currently listening to 2 books, which I won't be able to wrap up right now because I'm in the middle of them, one of which is Children of Blood and Bone by Tomiyami Yeti. I am planning on doing a whole entire video just on this book though, so you'll get to see that really soon. And then the other one, which is one that I am listening to, is The Emperor Blades by Brian Staveley. I am listening to this like I just said. I am loving this. I believe it is going to be a 5-star read for me. I'm going to tell you really quickly what it's about before we move on to the rest of the books because I'm hoping to finish it today actually, so I won't be putting it in my next month's wrap up if I'm able to do that. So this book is following the death of an emperor, and he has 3 children who have been spread out throughout the land. This epic high adult fantasy takes place based on the Tang era in Chinese history, and it has lots of historical feel to it. You definitely feel this like sense of Chinese history. The author himself is white, but he speaks on his website and on Goodreads about how much research and study he put into Chinese myth and culture to be able to write this book. So that's at least really nice to hear. He also studied highly in-depth Buddhism, Taoism, and Shinto. He definitely has those influences in this book, although he does say himself that he kind of branches away from them and gets into having more of a fantasy feel to the book. So it's not a history textbook. There's fantasy elements in the book. It's very, very enjoyable. So you're following these 3 children. They're all adults. The oldest of which, who is supposed to take his father's place, is off on the countryside studying to be a monk, and he doesn't know yet, because it's a month's journey to get to him, that his father has died and that he is basically the emperor, and he is studying underneath this horrible tutelage where this man is basically torturing him, teaching him how to empty his mind in such a way that he can understand the information in the world around him. And there are reasons for all of this, and it totally makes sense once you get towards the end of the book. But while you're reading it, it's just totally terrible what's happening to him. The next kid is a son who is basically studying under this warrior band who's very similar to like extreme special forces, and he is trying to graduate so that he can lead his own group to help protect the emperor. He knows that his father is dead and that his brother is now the new emperor, but he is not able to leave the school in order to go tell his brother and protect his brother from the forces that are probably going to do both of them harm. So he is trying to train to be basically the best graduate that he can be, get a really good team together, prove that they can handle things, and then go off and protect his brother, and hoping that that all happens within the few months that it would take someone else to get to his brother. Third child, who is an adult, so child's the wrong word, is the daughter, and she is actually still at the palace. She never left. She didn't see her father die, but was right there when he died and knows exactly who did it, and is trying to persecute this man and bring him to justice. Now, in this land, women are not allowed to hold the title of emperor. There is a lot of misogynistic traits throughout the book, and at first I was having a hard time dealing with some of those, but I went online and the author actually spoke to it and said that if you were feeling this way in book 1, that you should keep reading, because in the later books things happen and stuff goes down and you won't always feel this way. So I feel a lot better continuing reading this book when the author himself directly addresses it. So she is made the Minister of Finances, I believe, and she is basically left in a position of power, but not quite powerful enough to do the things she wants to do. And she is dealing with more of the court politics and trying to figure out, there's a man in the place of the emperor until they can get the new emperor back, trying to figure out what his motivation and faults are, and trying to get the man who killed her father to be persecuted properly so that he can be brought to justice. And it is so good. I am 14 hours into the 19-hour audiobook, so I'm really hoping that today I can just sit down and finish it, but I'm loving it, and I totally think it is a 5-star read. There is so many dark elements, so many horrible things that happen. I really love my fantasy books to just torture the characters that are in it, so like, if you love high fantasy, if you love epic fantasy, if you love dark fantasy, I totally recommend this as a series for you to check out. Of course, I've only read book 1. I own book 2, and I'm going to be jumping right into it as soon as I can, and hopefully continuing on with book 3 and 4. That's it on books that I'm currently reading. I'm not going into detail about Children of Blood and Bone because I'm going to be doing a video on that, but I wanted to go into detail with this one for you so that you could check it out. Okay, so let's talk about something else that happened this month real quick. So one of the stats I like to keep every single month is how many books that I own that have not been read. So I call it my physical TBR shelf, even though a lot of the books are audiobooks, so they're not technically physical, whatever, you get the point. So I've been keeping track of this for 4 months now. This will be the 4th month that I've been doing it, and I was doing really good, honestly. 4 months ago I had 40 books on the shelf, and then the next month I had 38, and then the next month I had 18, which was last month, and I was so proud of myself for getting the number down to 18, and I felt so accomplished that I failed. I completely and utterly failed myself. I officially have 32 books on that shelf right now. I went out and had a really rough month this past month. I was quarantined for 3 weeks and then told that I was completely safe to go out into the world. If you want to know some of the details, go watch the vlogs from this past month. Basically, I rewarded myself by buying books, and then on top of that, Audible had like a ton of sales that happened this past month. So they had like 2 or 3 buy 2 books for 1 credit deals, which I love those deals and I do them a lot. I am currently looking into actually switching out of Audible because of a lot of the things that have been going on with Amazon, the company, but I still have credits with them and I want to spend those before I make the final switch. So it probably before the end of the year, you're going to be seeing me switch over to a different audio source, but for right now, I'm still using them, and so I'm using the buy 2 for 1 credit deals as I can. And then they also did a summer deal where they sold particular audiobooks for $6.95, and there were tons on there that I wanted to get, but I think I only ended up buying 1. So that's at least a little bit better than I thought it was going to be. I do have 32 books on my physical TBR. Now, I don't do any kind of reward or punishment system with this. It's just I want to try to read as much of the books that I already own before I read the other books. I definitely sent myself into some panic attacks thinking about the fact that I was gonna have to come and tell you that I bought more books than I read this past month. But I realized that it didn't actually matter because I'm planning on reading all of the books I own. No punishment, no reward, it's just what it is. The final stats that I want to talk to you guys about before we get into the wrap-up section of this video is the kind of numbers, I already been talking about numbers, the kind of percentages, I guess, of what I've been reading. So like I said, I've read 17 books this month. I'm going to be looking at my stats, so I apologize I'm not looking at you. 3 of which were rereads for me, 6 of which had authors of color, 8 of which were female, and I know that that seems low, but I've actually been trying to read a few more male authors, because if you go and watch my statistics, my 6-month statistics video, I only read like 20 to 30% of the books I read were by male authors. So I wanted to introduce more male authors and more non-binary authors, which I failed to do this past month, unfortunately, but I was able to up the number of male authors I was reading. I read, on average, the book I read was 335 pages, and on average, the audiobook I listened to was 612 minutes long. 8 of the books I read were in a series, and the average rating that I gave to a book this month was 3.3. I had 3 books that were 5 stars, 1 book that was 4.75 stars, so really dang close, 4 books that were 4 stars, 1 book that was 3.5 stars, 1 book that was 3 stars, 1 book that was 2.5 stars, and 6 books that were 2 stars. Oh my god. I look back on this month and I think of it as a really enjoyable month. Like, I think about the books that I read and I feel like I enjoyed a lot of them, but according to the numbers, that's just not the case. Let's move on to the part of the video where I talk about the books. Wow, I have read a lot of books and I'm not even done with the month yet. How many books have I read so far? I've also DNF'd a lot of books this month, which is probably unfortunate. I'll run through those really quickly first, and then we'll get into the books that I read in the first 20 days of July. Right off the bat, I ended up starting and DNFing Imagine Me by, oh, what's the author's name? Tahira Mafi. I've read all the other books in this series, so I thought I'd give this one a shot. I don't dislike the books in this series. I think that they're pretty okay, but I really couldn't stand this one. Juliet, the main female protagonist in the story, was just kind of whiny and I didn't care about her. I made it probably 30% through the book too, because it's not a very long story and I just couldn't continue. And then after that, I ended up starting and DNFing Wise Man's Fear. Technically, I am only putting this book on pause and I am not done with it. I'm going to give it another shot in the future, but I DNF'd it because it was slow. There was nothing happening. I probably made it 30 to 40% through this book and absolutely nothing happened, and I was so bored with myself and it was really putting me into a reading slump, so I decided to stop trying to force myself to read it and pick up something else I enjoyed. The next book I DNF'd was The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. I started this book and was loving it. It reminded me so much of The Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. I was really getting into it, and then after about 10%, it started being all world building and no character development, and there were so many characters I had no clue what was going on. I was so lost and I couldn't stand it, and out of the tons and tons of people, there was one female character and she was not a good representation of female characters, and a lot of the male characters were extremely misogynistic, and I just didn't want to keep reading that, so I DNF'd that one. I put a really short blurb on Goodreads, so if you want to know some details, you can go read it there. And then after that, I DNF'd the book Ashes of the Sun by Django Wexler. This one I think might also be on pause, and I'll try to get back to, but basically I really enjoyed the story and the world building and the characters, but there were a few things that happened within the plot that weren't interesting me. I started and DNF'd The Dragon Republic. I made it also about 30% into this book. It's by R.F. Kuang. Again, it was boring. Nothing was happening. I was bored. I was bored out of my mind. I couldn't stand it. It felt like Rin, the main character, just wasn't doing anything, and it didn't feel like she was really herself in this book. And I was supposed to be reading this with my book club, so I just at chapter 15 had to tell them, guys, I can't do it anymore, I'm sorry. And then I put on pause the book The Ruin of Kings by Jen Leon, and that is simply because I needed to focus on some other books. It had nothing to do with the book not being interesting. It was just I needed to wrap up some other stuff before the end of the month, so I put that one on pause. I will be going back to it though, so I won't talk about it in this video. Let's get into the books that I read. Right at the top of the month, I started and finished Nevernight by Jay Kristoff, which I read for my book club fantasy reads. The link will be down below in the description if you'd like to read with us in the future. So Nevernight is a story talking about Mia. Her father was killed because he was a traitor when she was, I believe, 9 or 10 years old, and ever since then she has been working with a man who is basically training her so that she can one day go to this school of assassins. Now, I hope this isn't a spoiler for you all, but about 100 pages in, she gets to that school and she trains there to be an assassin, and it seems that not everything is as she thought it was. She meets some characters that are really awesome. She meets some characters that are really bad. Basically, she trains in a few different arts of being an assassin. This book used to be an all-time favorite of mine. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars the first time I read it. This second read through, I didn't have as much of an enjoyable time with it, so I felt like most of the characters annoyed me. The world building was awesome, but the plot was slow, and I just couldn't get into it as well as I did the first time. I ended up rating it 4 out of 5 stars. I think that maybe it deserves more like a 3.75 out of 5 stars, but I'm going to be leaving it with a 4 out of 5 stars. I only tabbed the first 1/3 of it because I started to realize that I didn't care enough to continue tabbing the book. One of the really cool aspects of this book, and hopefully I'll flip to a page where I can find it, and it's the thing that a lot of people talk about, is it has footnotes throughout. I'm not finding any of them, of course. It has footnotes throughout the entire book, so that is something really interesting and unique to YA fantasy. I don't know if I'd call this YA. I guess it's YA fantasy. It's kind of in between YA and new adult fantasy, and it's something that a lot of people find enjoyable. It's something that a lot of people find annoying. I personally think that the footnotes add to the world building and add to the humor of the book, because it is a very humorous book. But I think that if the book had not had them, it would be a lot easier of a read for people to get through. But I myself didn't mind them. So the next book that I read was also for my book club, and that is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. So I have already read this book this year, and I've already talked about it, so I'm not going to be going into depth with it now. You can find it on one of my previous wrap-ups if you want to know more details. But I read it the first time, rated it 5 out of 5 stars. I read it the second time, didn't like it quite as much, but I still rated it 5 out of 5 stars. I use an alternative version of Cowpile to rate my books. I'll be talking about it sometime in the future, and it got almost the same exact score in that, but just slightly less. I also tabbed it for my book club. Next, I read 2 short stories that Amazon Unlimited offered in audiobook format, and that was Randomized by Andy Weir and Emergency Skin by N.K. Jemisin. I gave both of these books 2 out of 5 stars, as I was not a huge fan of them. Randomized was definitely more sci-fi, whereas Emergency Skin was more fantasy-esque. It did have some sci-fi elements into it. They're both stories about people making decisions and not knowing how the end thing is going to resolve, or how those decisions are going to affect later decisions. And what I realized from reading these stories is I really care about how things relate to people and how decisions affect things that are done, and I felt like I was really gypped not knowing what was going to become of these characters and of these worlds based on the decisions that they had made. So Randomized is following a casino kind of in the near future, where basically the numbers are no longer going to be random in the machine and people are going to start winning. So the main man decides to hire a team to come and fix that, and the whole entire team has some twists and turns where they decide to take advantage of the system. And then Emergency Skin is about an alien species who sends a person down to planet Earth to investigate something, and when he gets here he basically decides that humans did it right and he wants to become one. I don't think that's a really good explanation of that book. Basically, once he gets here, I don't remember if that's his pronoun or not, so I'm just going to start using they to describe the alien. Once they get here, they realize that humans are a lot different than the propaganda of their world described them as, and they start to think that maybe it's not so bad as everyone was telling them. So yeah, didn't love those. The next book I read was Mirage by, oh my goodness, I forgot the author's name, but I will show it here. So this book is a Moroccan-inspired sci-fi fantasy YA story, and I thought I was really going to love this, and in fact the first 50% of the book I did really enjoy it, but I ended up having a few issues with it. I talked more in depth in one of my vlogs from this past month about it. Basically all it came down to is there was one girl who is an exact match to the princess of this planet, and the princess is getting death threats from the rebels, so they crown, the kingdom, the palace, whatever you want to call them, ends up kidnapping the first girl and taking her to be a face double so that she can go into the more extreme situations and be the face of the royalty. And if she dies, it's not that big of a deal because she's just some nobody from nowhere. And the girl, of course, when she gets there, doesn't want to be there, kind of hates it, and falls in line with, you guessed it, some rebels who want to take over the throne and bring back the power to the people. So in case you're wondering, I really wasn't a huge fan of any of the parts that had to deal with the rebels. I feel like the writing in the story wasn't that bad, but there were a few plot holes that I didn't love. There was a specific one that I mentioned in my previous video where I talk about it, where the main girl is discovered for being a fake by someone in the palace, and that person basically is like, I think you should tell some other people. They don't blackmail her. They don't hold it against her. They're just like, hey, you should go tell this person and this person and this person. And the main girl is like, yeah, that's a good idea. And it drove me a little bit insane how quickly she put her trust into this person and how quickly she turned into a rebel and how quickly she was willing to go along with the scheme of these people. I wanted a little bit more stakes. They didn't feel real in the story. Any of the moments that the main girl was talking with the princess, I loved. I loved their interactions. The princess was an awful human being, and you could see her slowly getting a grip of humanity into her character whenever she was talking with the main girl, whose name is Armani, I think. I might be wrong about that. I'm having a hard time remembering her name. And I loved the moments when the main girl had to take the place of the princess. Of course, I love that trope. Anytime a peasant has to come in and pretend to be royalty is my jam. So I loved it. But unfortunately, I had too many issues with the book and I only ended up rating it 2.5 out of 5 stars. And I do think that it is a book that I would recommend to people going forward in the future. I enjoyed, like I said, the first 50% of it. I just had some issues with the plot specifically in the second half of the book. So after Mirage, I ended up picking up Gideon the Ninth for the second time this year, and I reread this in honor of Harrow the Ninth coming out in August. So I've already talked about this book this year already, so I'm not going to go in depth with it, but I absolutely love this book. I love it. I love it so much. Anyways, the first time I read it, I rated it 5 out of 5 stars. The second time I read it, I also rated it 5 out of 5 stars. I love this book so much. So this is a sci fantasy where you are following Gideon and her princess, Harrowhark the Ninth, as they are basically enemies who are brought together to try to find this, oh, how do I describe this? I should probably start over. So we are following two girls, Gideon the Ninth, who is a soldier for the Ninth House, and Harrowhark the Ninth, who is the princess of the Ninth House, as they are called to the first house to find this path that will lead one of them, Harrowhark, to immortal life, to be a necromancer for the first house so that she can serve the emperor on high. And there are all kinds of mysterious twists and turns and paths and all kinds of weird tests that they have to go through, and it's really interesting. There are 8 houses brought to this planet, each of the rulers of that house with their cavalier, who is their soldier. Gideon is the cavalier. And as things start happening and people are starting to unlock secrets and find more answers, people start dying off, and eventually it can't be ignored anymore. So yeah, this is a great book. I love it so much. I really love the ending. I think that it has such an impactful ending for not that long of a book, and I think that its ending is what made it stand out to me as something super special compared to a lot of other books that I've read. I also really love that it is space necromancer lesbians. Like, that's fantastic. And one of the things that, if you're worried about spoilers, this is a slight spoiler, so turn away, skip ahead 10 seconds if you don't want to know it, but I don't really think it's a spoiler. Gideon and Harrowhark are not lesbians for each other, and I think that that is something fantastic that we should see more of. I love it. Yeah, read Gideon the Ninth. So after Gideon the Ninth, I read the book Jade City is a low fantasy story inspired by Asian culture taking place in like modern day 1900s China, where there is an element of drug culture behind it and gang culture. It's very gang heavy. So we are following one gang as they are trying to understand and take power of their gang in this city. So we're following 4 kids, because they're all adults, of this one family, and the oldest of them is the leader of the gang. The second oldest is the like brute force of the gang. The third is the daughter. She wants nothing to do with the gang. She is trying to get out, get her education, and get a job where her family name isn't the only thing that is bringing her forward. And the fourth child is an adopted son who is training in this school to one day be in the gang, basically. And part of this story is that in this culture, it is very common to wear jade in your body as like adornments or jewelry, and people who wear jade have extra human, almost magical abilities. So they have extra strength, they can move extra fast, they seem to have extra human flexibility and fighting ability, but they can also sense people's auras and sense if people are following them. They can kind of almost see what people are thinking. I think it's more of like an emotional understanding of what people are feeling around them. I really enjoyed this book, and I buddy read it with a friend in my book club. We read it in 2 or 3 days. It was a quick read for a pretty long book. I love the Chinese representation in it, especially because the author herself is of Chinese descent, and so she really felt like she had done her research and understood this culture before she wrote the book. I also really enjoyed how jade was a symbolism for drugs and how they can control people and take over people's lives, and how you start out with a little bit but then it grows and grows and grows. I also really enjoyed the family dynamic. I think that watching the siblings interact with each other was so good. All the siblings didn't have the same relationship with each other as they did with their other siblings. You do get to see all 4 of their POVs, so that was really awesome. And it felt like there were real stakes in this book. Real things happened to real people, and it was wonderful. You also do end up following a few other characters throughout the story for a few different chapters, and that allowed you just to understand the world in a broader sense. I think the world was fantastic. I'm not a huge fan of low fantasy, so I think it did lose a few points in my book for that, just because I really do love high fantasy. I love getting brought into deep worlds of magic in medieval times and fighting dragons with magic, whatever. But I do have to say that if you're not a fan of low fantasy, I still think you'll enjoy this book. One of the biggest issues I had with it, and it's not a big issue at all because it was only brought up 2 or 3 times, and it was balanced with this other element that tried to argue against it, and that is that a lot of the women in the book were treated as lesser or inferior. And the reason why I say that it was fought against in other elements of the book is because there were also lots of women that were seen as superior and excellent and had titles of power and positions of power. It's hard for me to say that the book didn't treat women fairly when it clearly did treat some women fairly but others not. And I talked a lot with my friend who I read this book with, who is of Asian descent, and she had to say that the elements that it had were very realistic, and that's why she loved it, and that shouldn't be an issue in my book. And it's not, but it was still there, and it's something I want to just bring up with you guys and talk about, because if that's something that really bothers you, I don't think this is the book for you to continue on and read. But I did really enjoy it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I could see me going on with the next book. So after that, I read the book The Shadows by Alex North. This is the first NetGalley audiobook that I listened to. It is an ARC that I received, so I believe the book is published now, so you can go check it out yourself. I don't normally listen to anything outside of fantasy, but I have recently been finding out that I'm really enjoying thriller/horror audiobooks, so I decided to pick this one up, and I am so glad that I did. I don't regret it for 1 second, and I am putting The Whisper Man on my TBR for future months. I don't even know how to talk about this book. How am I going to describe this book to you all? The Shadows is following a man and a woman. The woman is a detective. She is trying to figure out the murder of this child and trying to figure out what's happening, has seen that it is something that is like a copycat killing, and she's trying to figure out who done it, basically. Her name is Amanda, my name's Amanda, that's fantastic. And then we're following this man, was his name? Paul. His name was Paul. Then we're following Paul, both as he is an adult, trying to figure out, oh my god, there's murders happening, and dealing with the after effects of him being a child who had to deal with something very similar to this copycat killing. And then we're also following him as a child as he's becoming friends. Him and his best friend are becoming friends with these 2 other boys. One of them is named Charlie, and Charlie seems to be a little bit different. So the main part of the story is following Paul as he is trying to figure out whether or not he should be friends with Charlie. And it starts off with the very beginning, as you know that some type of murder has happened and you know that Charlie is somehow connected to this murder, and you know that Paul needs to get rid of Charlie, that Charlie is a danger to society, but you don't know anything else about that. And then you keep following these three different perspectives, two of them being Paul's at different time, as you're trying to piece together what happened to Charlie, because you know he's not around when Paul is an adult. So you follow them as their children throughout most of the book, and Paul's best friend is being like put underneath the spell of Charlie, and Charlie seems to have almost extra human abilities. On their first day with school together, he predicts someone's death that happens later that day. As they are going on and on, he talks more about lucid dreaming and bringing them all into the same dreams together, and he's working on different triggers so that they can dream different things together and then go out and bring justice to the town. But the issue is that Paul doesn't believe that the justice Charlie wants to bring is real justice at all. And Charlie has this huge focus on bringing justice to the people who have done him wrong specifically. So it was a very spooky book. I really felt like I was on the edge of my seat and I wanted to know what was going to happen. I finished the book in one day. I really enjoyed all of it, except the ending, when you get the final resolve of who done it and why they did it, and all of the like final end of book details that wrap up mystery thrillers. And unfortunately I can't talk to you all about it because that would spoil the entire book for you. Very reminiscent feels to many of Stephen King's book, specifically The Outsiders, which is one I've read by him. It's definitely not as long as that, and it doesn't get as slow as that one does, because I know a lot of people have issues with the slowness of it, but the fact that there was this kind of gruesome crime that people are following and there's a few different perspectives, those all reminded me of it. And then also within the book, Alex North references different Stephen King novels throughout, so you know that he's definitely read them, and I can definitely see that influence in his work. The next 4 books I'm going to be talking about are also all ARCs, and they're also all graphic novels that I got from NetGalley, because this month I found out that NetGalley has graphic novels, and I was so excited that I requested 5 of them, thinking I'd only get like 1, and I got 4 of them, so get ready to talk about those with me. The first book that I read was the Tea Dragon Tapestry, and this was a mistake because this is the 3rd book in a series that I have not read any other books in. I did end up deciding to read it anyways and give it a shot. The artwork was super gorgeous. 10 out of 10. The best artwork I've ever seen in a graphic novel. I loved it so much. I wanted to frame every single page. The story is mainly following these 2 girls. They are lesbians, they are dating each other, as they are basically trying to overcome grief, try to overcome issues that have happened recently, try to figure out who they are and who they've become. It's all about finding yourself and moving on after hard things happen. This book has lots of LGBT racial representation. There were all types of people. There was a character who was disabled yet still a soldier. It was wonderful. I'm not going to go into any more details since it is the 3rd book in a series and I can't talk about any of the previous 2, and I don't know what will spoil previous books, but I think that this book was really good for the target audience, which is middle schoolers. It was a middle grade graphic novel fantasy because it really could deal with grief and how different people overcome grief in a very manageable way for younger audiences without talking down to them. So I think this would be fantastic, but I myself didn't absolutely love it. So I ended up rating it 3 out of 5 stars because I see the importance of what it did, but I didn't love every aspect of it. So after that, I read the graphic novel adaptation of Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. and who else is in it? And Ryan North. So I have read Slaughterhouse-Five before, and if you watch the vlog where I talk about this book, you'll know that I only ended up rating Slaughterhouse-Five 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was actually higher than I thought I had rated the original book. So I think that in all actuality, I probably should have rated it more like a 4 out of 5 star book, because while I loved the story and I loved what it was talking about, I found the book to be very confusing, and I felt like there were many times I didn't know quite exactly what we were talking about. But the graphic novel solved all of that. Having the pictures along with the words allowed me to understand not only when the main character was time traveling, because that happens, but also allowed me to understand where exactly we were and to understand the difficulties of the war. So Slaughterhouse-Five is a story that follows Billy Pilgrim as he is fighting in World War II in Dresden right before the bombing, and he becomes unstuck in time, which means that he experiences different moments of his life at different times, and he seems to remember all of those different times. So he might be walking through the woods trying to escape German soldiers, and then all of a sudden he is walking in his house when he is 60 years old, or he's walking to school when he is 7 years old. It doesn't seem to have any correlation, and the weirdest part is he doesn't seem to really be concerned about this fact. He's kind of learned not to tell people that he's unstuck in time because they think he's going insane, but he can tell you things like exactly when he's going to die, who's going to kill him, or how he's going to die. And what's really, really strange is when he gets back from the war and is trying to come back into his normal life and is trying to settle down, have a wife, have kids, whatever, he gets kidnapped by aliens and is taken to their planet to be a zoo exhibition. And he is basically watched by these aliens as they try to figure out what makes humans happy, what excites them. At one point they bring him some other humans and it kind of happens and all that stuff. I won't say what. And eventually he is brought back to Earth where he lives out the rest of his days. The very ending of his life does alter from the original story, which is something I didn't mention in my vlogs, but I loved the graphic novel. I thought the artwork was unique and original and added a nice character element to the story. Having the graphic novel allowed me to really understand the story in a way that I hadn't before, so I ended up rating this book 5 out of 5 stars. Love it. I highly recommend you checking this out when it comes out, I believe in September. So the next graphic novel that I read was Carmen Volume 1. And this was a really odd story. In fact, it was so odd I wanted to DNF it about halfway through, and I'm actually glad I stuck with it. So this is the story of a girl who kills herself, and then she is assigned a caseworker who is supposed to help her move on into her next life. It deals with reincarnation, the idea of not being able to take your memories into the next life. It deals with death. It deals with the burden that we bring other people in our lives and after our lives have ended. It talks a lot about relationships, abandonment, friendships, all kinds of things. It talks about friends moving on. It talks about how in our deaths we almost learn how to live, and then how when you're brought into your new life you've forgotten that all the things you've learned, and how it's not fair because it doesn't really change anything, and that if reincarnation is real, how just because we did something in one life, say you get a really shitty situation in your second life as like karma for your first life, it doesn't really do anything because in your second life you don't remember anything bad that you did in your first life to make amends for that situation. But it was actually a fantastic novel. I ended up rating it 4 out of 5 stars. It was so weird and so bizarre, but if you check it out, I recommend sticking around to the end. It's only like 160 pages or something, so just give it a shot if you're wanting to. The book does have a lot of trigger warnings. There is on-screen suicide. I guess it's not a screen, on-page suicide. You definitely see someone with not only wounds on their arms after they have self-harmed, but also bandages throughout most of the story. There is nudity, a lot of nudity. There is on-page sex that you see. There is a lot of topics of death, abandonment issues, a lot of feelings of inadequacy, a lot of issues that are not necessarily dealt with. So it was a hard one to read, but I really recommend it and I enjoyed it a lot. One of the things that I will definitely say is you got to be okay with nudity, as the main character is nude throughout most of the story. And one of the things I really, really loved, and it's slightly a spoiler, so if you don't want it, turn away right now. The main character throughout most of the story leads you to believe that she's dealing with a breakup that was her boyfriend, but you learn about halfway through that it is a breakup with a friend, and I loved that. I felt like that was so refreshing and so good, because we're always so focused on boyfriends that it was nice to deal with childhood friends leaving for a change. I just felt like that was a topic I needed to read about in the moment. Final graphic novel that I read for this month was Strange Skies Over East Berlin, and this is dealing with a spy in East Berlin right before the end of the war, and he goes to investigate this odd happening that took place in a Russian scientist bunker. And when he gets there, he realizes that there are aliens on Earth. That's the whole summary. I don't know exactly what to say about this book. It was slow. It was boring. Nothing happened. The art was really cool, but could be extremely confusing in certain aspects of it. Nothing was resolved. Nothing actually was said about aliens or humans, really. Like, there was a message throughout the book, but I felt like it didn't have a good resolve to it. That's all I'm going to say about this book. I ended up rating it 2 out of 5 stars. Didn't love it. And then after that, I listened to the audiobook for We, which is a very classic Russian dystopian story. It inspired great classics that we know and love, like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, and yet I couldn't stand it. It reminded me very, very much of 1984, but not as well developed and misogynistic and bad. I'm so sorry. So this was another book for my 12 and 12, which I wanted to read this next coming year, and I didn't like it. So we're following this man as he is in this society where everything is planned out for you, programmed for you, down to what you're going to eat, what time you're going to eat, when you're going to work, what you're going to work on, who you're going to be with, when you're going to be with them, everything. And he comes across this woman who basically uses her womanly ways to get out of that, and she basically seduces men to allow herself to not live within those structures of society. And of course, she introduces the main man into this rebel organization that wants to do away with this stuff. So if you've read 1984, you can see that the similarities are definitely within the culture. Big Brother is kind of very similar to the government of this book, and you kind of get the same feeling of like a woman introduces a man into being a rebel. But I didn't like this one at all. I felt like it wasn't good. I felt like the reasons why the man was interested in being with the woman in the first place weren't actual good reasons. I felt like they were not explained well. I couldn't see any reason why either of the people would want to be with each other. And then I was really interested in the world and the society, and I felt like the writing was actually not that bad, but the plot was just not there, and I didn't get to see enough of the world or get enough explanation of the world to really be invested in it. So yeah, I ended up skimming the second half of the book, so I know how it ends. And I think that if you're interested in this book and you haven't read 1984, just go and read 1984. The ending was much more impactful in that one and stands out to me as one of my most interesting endings that I've ever read in a book. Whereas with We, I have a lot of issues with how it ended, and I'm not a fan of it. So I only rated this book 2 out of 5 stars, and that's all I'm going to say about it. The final book that I read in the first 20 days of July, then we're going to cut to me talking about the rest of them in the future month, and that is Legacy of Ash by Matthew Ward. Oh my god, this is another book from my 12 and 12. I've been knocking out those books really well. I'm proud of myself. This book, if you're a fan of fantasy, stop and go buy this book right now. This is the greatest fantasy book I have ever read. I loved it more than my previous favorite fantasy series, which was Lightbringer by Brent Weeks. I loved it more than Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I loved it more than Stormlight by Brandon Sanderson. I loved this book. I'm going to be doing a whole entire video on this book. That's how much I loved it. But for the time being, I'll tell you a quick little thing about it. And I'm going to say right now that this is my new favorite book I have ever read. When I put it into call pile, only one other book has ever beaten it, and that is Vicious by V.E. Schwab, which is the perfect book. But this somehow, in like my enjoyment of it, was better than Vicious. Like Vicious earned a 10 out of 10 because it is, by all means, in my mind, a perfect book. This was not a perfect book, but it is the closest you can get. Oh my god. Oh my god. So this book follows a large cast of characters after a war failed. So the prequel starts off with Katya, the leader of the rebel organization, dies. She is the chosen one, the phoenix, the one who is supposed to come into power and bring her people justice, and she dies. And then you cut 15 years into the future, and you're following the oppressors as they have taken over the people that she was trying to free. You're following the people who were trying to be freed, and you're following their enemies who are about to declare war on them and try to bring both of them to their knees. And the oppressors are basically coming to the oppressed saying, we can't stop them on our own, but if you help us fight them, we're going to give you more justice, more freedoms. We're going to let you not be free, but we're going to let you be a lot better off. And so we're following lots of POVs in this book. But the main ones that we're following is Victor, who is a witch, and witches are burned in this culture. So he is on the High Council, and he is the one who everyone believes killed Katya. And he basically is dealing with the grief of lying to everyone about that. He doesn't care that he is thought to be a killer because he's killed tons of people before, but he feels bad that everyone thinks he killed this woman who was actually this great person, and he's starting to wonder if maybe her thoughts and beliefs were actually how people should be going. And then we're following both of her children who are 15 years apart, Jasiri and Carmen. So Jasiri is basically the ruler of the oppressed people. He is living in exile pretty much, and he is trying to bring his mother's name out of shame and give her some justice. Where he is at, he is dealing with people who were against her and people who were for her. And he is trying to walk the middle line between them and trying to figure out how he can bring what his mother wanted to this land. And then Carmen is trying to escape her family's name. She's trying to marry another man so that she can get a different last name and no longer be part of this family. She wants nothing to do with her brother. She wants nothing to do with her mother's legacy, but she is thrown into this war where she basically has to ignore what she wants and become the next phoenix. And then we're following tons and tons of other characters who are doing such fantastic and wonderful things. So some of the things I really, really loved about this book, there was LGBT representation, there was different racial representation, there was disability representation, there was a huge battle scene right in the middle, and that wasn't the like major plot of the book. That wasn't like the end all be all of the book. There was plot around it, there was political intrigue, there was I don't even want to tell you everything because you're just gonna have to go watch the video where I talk really in depth about this book, because it's my favorite book ever written and I love it, and I've already pre-ordered the sequel, not because there was a huge cliffhanger at the end, there was kind of, but because it was so good. I just want to always be reading words that Matthew Ward has put onto paper. It was so fantastic. I loved it. So one of the big things I do want to say before I leave about this book is that the women and men are seen as completely equal in this land, and it is something that actually I didn't notice right away, because the way they talk about it is that it's not something new. It's not like something to be talked about, because it's just so obvious to everyone that men and women are equal. Why would we go and talk about it? Also, no one is persecuted for who they love or who they're with. It's just let everyone do their thing. Who cares who they are or what they are? Just whatever they can bring to the table is what we care about. So before I leave, I would like to talk really briefly with you all about a book that I read at the end of June that I didn't get to talk about in my wrap up. And that is because I read it after I had already exported the video. I basically exported the video on the 30th of the month, and then I put it up on YouTube to post. If you read the description at the bottom of it, I did quickly do like a little blurb there, but I want to say a few things in this video about it because I really enjoyed it and I want to talk to you all about it. That was the book I'm thinking of ending things, and I read this because Kat from Paperback Dreams recommended it, and I'm so glad I tried it out because I listened to the audiobook and it was the scariest book I've ever read. It is the first time that I have read / listened to a horror book and actually been scared, which, to be fair, I finished the book around 10:30 at night, and I usually go to bed at 10 p.m. So like, yeah, maybe I was a little bit more spooked because it was nighttime, but it was so enjoyable. I'm not going to tell you like a real summary because I think that'll spoil things for you, but I'm going to really briefly tell you kind of what the book is about. So we're following this girl as she goes to meet her boyfriend's parents for the first time. And they have a long drive together. They show up at her parents' house, and then stuff happens. Not what you think happens, though, I'll tell you that much. So she, the entire time, is telling him stories about her childhood. He's kind of telling stories, not so much about his life, but just kind of talking with her and stuff. And she is thinking in the back of her head that she wants to break up with him, but she doesn't know whether or not she really wants to do it or whether or not she should just stick it through. She kind of went on this trip feeling guilty that she was leading him on, but didn't know how to do it, didn't know if she actually wanted to do it, and yeah. So I'm not going to tell you anything else about it because that'll definitely be spoilers. I rated it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and the only reason why I didn't get a full 5 stars is because, once again, the ending was disappointing. I'm not going to tell you what that ending is. I definitely think you should read it. I definitely think it is a book that I will reread in the future. It was eerie and spooky because of the writing, whereas like nothing really happens in it, but the entire time you're on the edge of your seat being like, oh my god, what's about to happen? Everything is like overly described in a gross way. So it's not necessarily scary until the end when I was super creeped out and super scared, but the entire time it's just unsettling, and the unsettling feeling just builds and builds and builds until you get to the climax of the story and it all shatters and you're just sitting there spooked out. And I really enjoyed it. I think you all should check it out if you like thrillers. Now you can go back to the rest of the books I read this month. Okay, and so let's really quickly talk about the books that I read in the last week of the month. So you already know what I'm currently reading. I've already talked to you about that. So the first book that I started out with was His and Hers by Alice Feeney, and this was an ARC that I received from Macmillan Audio on NetGalley to review in exchange for an honest review. Yeah, you know the deal. Anyways, I picked this one up because I'm really interested in reading some more thrillers, and I really found out that I enjoy listening to thrillers, so they had this one available for me and I decided to try it out. So this story is all about lies and deception. You're following two unreliable narrators, his and hers, and technically a third perspective who you don't know who it is, and you think that it could possibly be one of them. And the third perspective is the person who did the murder. So his and hers, I'm totally forgetting what their names are right now, but that's fine. I'll just call them his and her for right now. She is a TV journalist for, I believe it is BBC News, and she basically has to go and report on this vicious, horrible crime that happened in the small hometown where she grew up in. He lives there, is a detective there, and is investigating the crime that happened there. Now, I don't want to give any spoilers away, but they know each other from their past. They have a good connection to each other, and where they are at currently, they're not really fans of each other. As they continue on, there are more and more clues throughout the book that hint that either one of them could be the murderer. And then, like I said, every few chapters, you get this part where the person who is actually the murderer comes in and kind of tells you about the murder scene and why they think the person deserved to be murdered. So that perspective was actually the main reason why I didn't love this book. So I ended up reading this book 2 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed the back and forth and the unreliable narrator part. First off, I want to say that that part I enjoyed, and I really enjoyed finding out more and more about the crime. But as we found out more and more about the crime, you would also find out more and more about the people's pasts, which would supposedly help you understand why or why not they did this crime. And I didn't love learning about their childhood. I felt like the part where we were learning about who they were, specifically the woman who she was as a kid and her backstory with her mom and dad and her friends in school, just didn't do it for me. I understand at the end of the novel why it was so important to have, because it did help you understand who the murderer was, but I wasn't into those parts and they bored me a lot. I think a big deal with why I didn't love them is because the daughter was super ungrateful for her circumstances. Basically, for a good chunk of her life, she was raised in poverty by a single mother who cleaned people's houses, and the mother cleaned people's houses who were in positions of power, such as like the school principal, in exchange for her daughter to go to this really nice, prestigious school, and yet the daughter still couldn't see the effort that her mom was putting in for her. And by the end of the novel, I understand that, one, she was a teenager, and that is how a lot of teenagers act. I was not that way as a teenager. I never went through the phase where I was ashamed of my parents or was ungrateful for my parents. So when I read books about that kind of stuff, it's a little bit harder for me to relate to the characters. And then on top of that, it was just not super enjoyable to watch her like trash her mom as she's trying her literal hardest. Although I will say the alcoholism is inherited. Her mother has lots of issues, isn't a perfect woman, but it was hard for me to see that. I guess I don't love broken families in my stories. If you're more okay with that, this might be something you'd be more interested in. Now let's talk about the other POV that I mentioned earlier and said I had issues with. One of the biggest issues I had with this unknown POV talking, what was really cool is it was a distorted voice. Like when you see on the cop shows when they distort a voice, that's how that voice was talking to us whenever it would have chapters, so you didn't know who was actually supposed to be that voice. One of the issues I had with it though was the way that it talked about the woman who was murdered. Now I understand that the woman who was murdered was a horrible woman. She had opened up a charity and was literally stealing money from her own charity. Now the book though has the person who killed her talk about that woman in just not a great way, because you don't know whether or not it's a woman or a man who is the murderer. I don't want to call it like woman hate, but it was definitely like the author was hating on women who weren't like her. Like she referred to the woman as a whore, as a slut. She at one point talked about the fact that like the murdered woman had dyed blonde hair and fake nails, and referred to the woman as being a fake person, just like her fake personality. And like you get to learn a lot more about the murdered woman, and you get to learn how awful she actually is as a person and was as a teenager. But for that to be your first impression of her was like not super great. And then they also trash her a lot for cheating on her husband, which is a whole entire issue that I'm not going to get into. And yet there is lots and lots and lots of cheating on your spouse throughout the book that I feel like other characters didn't get the same crap about. So I didn't love the whole entire like mentality of victim blaming that they seem to give the main woman that was murdered, and I didn't love the relationships of a lot of the characters, and I just had issues throughout where I felt like I was really interested in the first 40% of the book, and then the last 60% of the book was really slow. The next book that I read was Girl Serpentthorne by Melissa, I believe it's pronounced Bash Ardust. I'm so sorry if I am wrong about that. I know that the audiobook had her name in it, but it has been a little bit since I finished this audiobook. Way different than I thought it was going to be, first off. I also got this book from Macmillan Audio through NetGalley in exchange for an honest review. I will just kind of say that to you all before I talk about the book really quickly. I am not going to go super in depth with this one because I'm actually using this book in examples for another video that I'm doing, and so I really go in depth with the analysis of it there. And if you want to know some more specifics, you can go on my Goodreads. I did write a really nice and long review for it. I ended up rating this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. It is a YA fantasy and it is a retelling, so I kind of have some issues with retellings myself. I find that the language used to write them just doesn't click with me personally, so I think that that was one of the reasons why it didn't get a 4-star. And then also, if I'm correct, this is a debut novel. If I'm incorrect, it felt like a debut novel, and I think that as the author continues on, I could see myself picking up more books by her and rating them 4 or 4.5 stars. But this one was 3.5, which is a really decent rating, honestly. So it is an Own Voices Persian retelling of, oh my god, what myth is it? I believe it's Goose Girl, but I might be wrong about that, so don't quote me on that one. I think Goose Girl was actually Thorn. So I don't remember what this is a retelling of, and I apologize for that. But it was about this girl who is poisonous to the touch, and she and her twin brother are royalty, and her twin brother is about to take over the throne. I don't remember the exact term, but it's not king. He's not going to become king. Is it a sultan? It might have been Sultan. I'm so sorry that right now I'm pulling a blank. The other review is going to be so much better when it comes out. I apologize for this one being trash. Anyways, I really liked this book, honestly. I felt like it stood out to me as something really good. The writing, I personally, even though I said felt debut-ish, I felt like it was better than a lot of YA fantasy that I read. And on top of that, the plot was so much better than YA fantasy, like traditional YA fantasy. Like, no, it was not Six of Crows level plot, but like, why does everyone like refer to Six of Crows as the book that is like the ultimate? I mean, I love it too, but like, come on guys, it's a heist book. We're not going to get anything better than that. Anyways, I loved it. Every single time I felt like the author was about to take me down a road that I was like, oh, this is so predictable YA fantasy, she would mix it up in some unique way that I was still interested in it. Like, yes, it was predictable YA fantasy story that we're used to hearing, but like at the same time, she did it in such a way that it felt fresh and new to me, and I just really enjoyed it. I also think that I really enjoyed it because the romance in the story doesn't really happen until near the end of the story. So not only does that build you the ability to enjoy the two characters separate from each other and together, but you also are kind of rooting for them. And one of the biggest pluses, from my own opinion, in this book is from the beginning, when you first meet the love interest, you don't realize that it's the love interest. And I say it because this story has a LGBT plus main character. I don't technically know if she has a label given to her. The story doesn't give her an exact label. It does have a female-female relationship at some point in the story, but she also sort of goes into a relationship with a male character. And what's really cool is you don't know which one of those is going to be the relationship at the end necessarily. I do think that it would have been nice if we could have seen some more Persian design influence in the cover, because I think that it's really important that all types of people see their culture in book covers, but it's pretty, so we're not gonna complain. Okay, one more book for you and then we will be outie. So the last book I read this month was The Gutter Prayer by Gareth Ryder. Oh my god, I can't see the end part of his name in this clip, but I'll put it right here. I actually own this book. It's over there on my shelf though. It's in my books to be unhauled, so I didn't feel like pulling it out of that stack, if that already tells you how I'm feeling about this book. So I'll just tell you right now, I rated this book 2 out of 5 stars. I ended up skimming the last 300 pages because I just really wasn't interested in it. The first 100 were really enjoyable for me, and then something just happened where I like didn't care about the characters, didn't care about the plot. It wasn't going where I thought it was supposed to be going, and it was kind of slow. And so when I wanted to continue to, I could see the ending, and I'll explain that in just a second. But when I read that ending, when I skimmed to that ending, it wasn't the ending I wanted it to be, which is kind of disappointing. So this book, what I thought it was supposed to be was a heist book. So you're following 3 specific characters who are thieves in this like horrible, dark, grungy city, and they, at the very beginning of the book, you are introduced into them where they are stealing something from this place and it goes horribly wrong, and they basically are trying to figure out the rest of the book what horrible thing went wrong. On top of that, you're also following this perspective, which is this man who is like a bounty hunter and is hunting them down, and he's also investigating this crime that happened and trying to figure out who's behind it, what's going down, what all that jazz is about. There is magic in this book. There are saints and ghouls and stone men in this book. You follow a few different types of characters, which is really awesome. Also, the book opens up in second person perspective and you get to experience this building. Like, you are the building and you get to experience the feeling of being robbed by these people, and you get to watch as like the thing goes wrong, and it's really, really cool. That chapter alone, 5 out of 5 stars. The rest of the book, not that great. So I really loved 2 of the perspectives in here. There was one of the thieves was a female, and she was kind of undergoing this like spiritual change almost, where she basically was first off finding out that the gods are real, and then also figuring out that they had kind of given her this gift that she didn't want. And so she had pretty early on been captured after the raid and sold to this like clergyman, and he had bought her because he wanted to help train her, thinking that it would get him more in touch with the gods and understanding like kind of what was going to be happening in this city. So I really loved learning all about that part. And then every once in a while she would have like this fainting spell where she would like experience something that wasn't actually happening to her, and the writing in those sections was awesome. I really loved it. It was so different and unique, and it was really, really cool to read. And then the other perspective I really loved was the bounty hunter that was hunting all 3 of them. He was very like cocky and arrogant and just kind of the general like gunslinger bounty hunter like personality that you expect from someone. I really love that kind of personality, and I think it's so much fun. So of course I'm gonna be trash for him. I think that this book had a lot of potential, but I would totally scrap most of the plot and reanalyze it, remake it into an actual heist book, because they're actually really, I mean, the first chapter is a heist, and then there's not a heist really the rest of the book. But I just like wasn't loving the characters. I wasn't loving the progression of the story. I wasn't enjoying myself. As soon as I would put the book down, I would be like, I don't want to pick that up again. And that's just not the feeling you want to have while reading a book. That's it. I know this video is going to be really, really long. All of my wrap-ups are. I'm not apologizing for that. I really enjoy talking to you guys about the books I read, and I think that I'm getting better at talking about them with you all. So that's really enjoyable for me to know that in just a few months I've already progressed this far into being like this much better at wrapping books up with you all. So that makes me happy. Anyways, comment down below if you've read any of these books, what you thought about them, or if you think I should give a second shot to some of the books that I DNF'd. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions. I have to get going because I actually have somewhere to be, so I don't remember how my outro goes, but until next time, I'll talk to you all in the comments. Bye!